and I'll hand it over to Chris to get us started.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. And I just want to say thank you to Bonnie with American Farmland Trust and Emmy Brawley with the Conservation Fund for leading this presentation. I just wanted to welcome everybody to this from the National Agricultural Land Network. We are a project of American Farmland Trust and are happy to bring these kinds of informational webinars and other types of peer networking and information gathering to help understand sort of new opportunities and challenges around agricultural land protection. We are very excited in this particular research and thinking about being able to quantify the benefits of agricultural land protection, particularly in the climate arena. And so with that, I just want to say that the National Agricultural Land Network would welcome any of you to join us. I like to say that a network is only as good as the members in it. You are welcome to join as an individual. You're welcome to join as an organization or an agency. And again, the purpose of the network is simply to promote information sharing and networking amongst all of us who are doing work around saving farmland and ranchland. So I will put more information about the network in the chat, but at this point, I believe I am turning it over to Bonnie, correct? Who will introduce herself and the project. And if I'm wrong and I'm turning it to Emmy,
Yes.
Please feel free to turning it to Emmy. So Emmy, to you, Emmy with the Conservation Fund. Thank you so much, Emmy.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I wanted to give just a quick background on how we got to work with AFT on this project. So I am with the Conservation Fund. I'm Great Lakes Regional Director based in Chicago. And we are the lead partner on a partnership effort in Illinois to integrate more habitat into Illinois' agricultural landscape using the USDA program under the Farm Bill called RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And our RCPP is using farmland protection easements as a tool to permanently protect farmland, to connect and buffer existing natural areas. And I was really interested in this research project because I wanted to better understand and I think help tell the story of how permanent land protection connects back to climate solutions. In particular, it was a little bit frustrating to me to see so many of Illinois' climate dollars going into an annual payment for 1 year installation of something like cover crops. But then a couple years down the road, that same land would be covered with warehouses, generating a lot of associated vehicle traffic. And I just thought we need to be talking about the opportunity to do a one-time payment with permanent land protection that results in permanent conservation outcomes. So I'd seen California invest in farmland protection easements using their greenhouse gas cap and trade dollars, and also seen the great work that AFT has done in New York and California that I think Bonnie's going to talk about. So with RCPP, it was a great opportunity to elevate a Midwest example and to help share the importance of farmland protection as a climate solution using a specific Midwest example. So thank you so much to AFT for their partnership, and also to USDA and RCS and the RCPP program for funding this work. And I'm really excited to get started. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris and Emmy, for those opening words. I'm Bonnie McGill. I'm a senior climate and soil health scientist at American Farmland Trust, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. If I can get a thumbs up from Jamie or someone that you're seeing my slides. Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you all for joining us today. You're seeing my face here, but this work is a joint effort by a big team, including Rachel Seaman-Varner, Ryan Murphy, Ann Sorensen, Shraddha Shrestha, Teresa Nogari-McCrae, Emmy Brawley, Mitch Hunter, and Bianca Mobius-Clean. There we go. So let's get started. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are coming together today because of our passion for the land. The land we know and love today has many millennia of human history, and what we do today affects its future and our future. The land we'll be talking about in this presentation is an area we know today as Tazewell County, Illinois, which is within the ancestral lands and rivers stewarded by the Peoria, Potawatomi, Osage, Kickapoo, and Miami peoples for many generations. These peoples continue to make important contributions to our modern understanding of the ecology and conservation of their ancestral lands. So the agenda for today's talk is we'll go through an introduction, cover some key terms, introduce you to the Bishop Farm and the easement. We'll go through a high-level summary of the methods, then we'll look at the results and talk about some of the limitations of the study. And we'll wrap up with a brief overview of a project we are working on now at AFT that's a nationwide calculator tool to use this method more widely. And then I'm hoping for a robust Q&A at the end. So please take note of comments and questions you have to bring up at the end. So let's look at some key terms to make sure everybody's on the same page. An agricultural conservation easement protects the long-term viability of the nation's food supply by preventing conversion of productive working lands to non-agricultural uses. Climate change mitigation, I like to explain with this diagram from Project Drawdown, which shows the current sources of human caused greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, and then the sinks that draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store it away from the atmosphere. Mitigation can happen in two ways, and both are important for us to be doing urgently at this time. And that is, we can reduce the emissions going into the atmosphere, and we can increase the strength of the sinks pulling gases out of the atmosphere. And so this includes carbon sequestration in soils, in cropping systems and rangeland systems. But today we're going to focus on reducing emissions into the atmosphere. So what do agricultural conservation easements and mitigation have to do with each other? So here I'm showing a diagram from our 2022 report, Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future. Excuse me. It shows how land uses exist on a continuum from high density urban areas to low density residential, and then to rural areas with agriculture and forestry. In this study, we're paying particular attention to the threat of low-density residential development on farmland. Low-density residential development encompasses areas where house lots exceed 1 to 2 acres, as well as some very large lot residential areas which might appear rural at first, but are primarily used for housing, not production agriculture. Farmland converted to low-density residential use tends to be more energy intensive per household than smart growth urban development. So smart growth urban development usually are smaller houses that have access to more efficient public transportation compared to low density residential areas farther from the city. And here these bubbles are representing, not to scale, but the greenhouse gas emissions per household. So if we have farmland or ranch land located near the urban fringe, and we put an agricultural conservation easement on it, where it can act as a barrier to urban sprawl encouraging more energy efficient and compact development in already developed areas, then the per household emissions are less thanks to the agricultural conservation easement. This is climate mitigation, reducing emissions to the atmosphere. Demonstrating that an easement actually does this is a little complicated, yet really important. If a farmland or grazing land parcel is not situated in a way that an easement on it supports more compact development, the easement has no climate benefit according to this methodology. Doing mitigation calculations on such an easement would potentially be misleading. In the example we're going to talk through here today, I'll talk through how we made the case that this is indeed mitigation. The two main criteria to qualify as climate mitigation are that it is threatened by development and supports a barrier to urban sprawl, which are sort of overlapping criteria. Before we get into more of the details of the study, I'd like to go over some of the prior work that we are building off of for the study today. Researchers at the University of California, Davis published a report in 2013 showing developed land in Yolo County, California emitted about 70 times the greenhouse gases per acre compared to emissions from irrigated cropland. A 2015 study by AFT found that acre for acre, California developed land emits about 58 times the greenhouse gases emitted by cropland. In 2017, AFT published a similar report focused on farmland vulnerable to development in New York, which found that New York's developed land emits about 66 times the greenhouse gases per acre emitted by farmland. These studies led the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, to make farmland protection through agricultural conservation easements part of their greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. In 2020, they released their agricultural lands and conservation easements quantitative methodology. This was also updated just at the end of last year. This method, it's important to note, and we'll look into it further in a few moments, uses a different methodology than the reports above. And we'll get into those in a few more minutes, but this is the method we used for our study. So before we get into those details, I'd like to introduce you to the Bishop Farm and the easement on it, the site of today's case study. The Bishop Farm is located in Tazewell County in central Illinois, and the county lies along the Illinois River. Shown here, we're zoomed in on the city of East Peoria, with the farm outlined in red. The farm contains 103 acres, of which 65 are in crops, 34 are in woods, and 4 are residential and roads. The cropland is predominantly managed by a tenant farmer who uses conventional corn soybean rotation with a small area managed in diversified vegetables. The dominant soils in the cropped area are all silt loam alphasols in the Rosetta, Stronghurst, and Birkbeck series. In Tazewell County, between 2012 and 2017, the number of farms declined by 9%, and acres in farms declined by 10%. Now I'm going to hand it over to Emmy to tell you more about this easements conservation story. And you go ahead and tell me when to click, Emmy, for the next slide.
Great. Well, I think it's also important just to flag that this easement makes a lot of sense for us in terms of our RCPP habitat goals, because the farm, although it's adjacent to the growing East Peoria city, it's also within a conservation opportunity area, which is the designation given in our statewide wildlife action plan as the highest priority areas for conservation in the state. The river running through the map is the Illinois River, and the dark green is existing protected lands. So our easement is actually the headwaters of Lick Creek, which flows into the Illinois River through a number of high quality, already protected natural lands, including about an 800 acre state designated Illinois natural area. So that's the conservation story. If you want to click forward, I can just share that the easement itself is an RCPP easement. These are entity held easements. I'll put a link in the chat for a little more information about the RCPP. Our easement holder is Prairie Lands Conservancy, so I want to make sure to thank them for their work on this project and highlight that in general, the deed terms that are put in place through easements that are funded by RCPP limit subdivision into a lot of small pieces that would make farming impossible, and also limit impervious surfaces. So those are the two big criteria that come with those RCPP easements: limits on impervious surface and limits on subdivision. And then I will put a link in the chat so you can learn more about our RCPP, but it's a phenomenal partnership of about 14 groups in Illinois. And I will turn it back over to Bonnie to get into the heart of things here.
Okay, thanks, Emmy. So let's take a closer look at the development threat facing the farm. We're looking at a Tazewell County zoning map, and Bishop Farm is right here. You can see that it's located in this sort of tan colored shape, which is an agricultural preservation district, which according to Tazewell County is intended to protect those areas which are best suited to the pursuit of agriculture in order to ensure that agriculture will continue to be maintained as a long-term land use and a viable economic activity within the county. Non-farm uses such as residential home sites on smaller tracts of land are discouraged. So that sounds good. And you can see that this shape, this farmland area is a nice buffer between East Peoria and the city of Morton to the southeast. However, according to the city of East Peoria's most recent planning document, Bishop Farm, which is located in this lower area within the yellow, it's in a zone that is slated for low density residential development. So given the farm's desirable location for East Peoria sprawl, the agricultural conservation easement is highly likely to be protecting the farmland from future low density residential development. And so is contributing to establishing a barrier between the East Peoria and neighboring cities. This supports infill of existing developed areas, of which there are many opportunities within existing East Peoria city limits. Of course, more easements within the agricultural preservation district would strengthen the community separator and the buffer of development. For these reasons, AFT, we concluded that the Bishop Farm agricultural conservation easement meets the prerequisites for calculating the greenhouse gas benefit from avoided conversion. So let's jump into a high-level overview of the methods. First, I want to reiterate that we were following the Agricultural Lands and Conservation Easement Quantitative Methodology from CARB. This is a method that has been peer-reviewed, is accepted for use in California, and as far as we know, the only methodology currently available for these types of calculations. So some of the key steps, which we'll go through each of these in the following slides, I'd be happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. So the first step is to estimate the number of development rights extinguished by the easement. In kind of regular language, that means estimating the number of households that would potentially be developed on the farm. Then you estimate the greenhouse gas benefits from avoided conversion on a per household basis and multiply it times the number of households you estimated would be developed. So the components of the greenhouse gas benefits are avoided vehicle miles traveled, avoided electricity and propane use, and avoided soil organic carbon loss. So let's look a little more carefully at how we estimated the number of development rights extinguished. This is probably the most difficult step. It involves working with spatial data and working in GIS, and would need to be happening on a case-by-case basis for using this method. So following the CARB method for at-risk of residential development, And I also want to say that if there were parts of the parcel with really steep slopes that probably would not be developed, or in floodplains, or somehow already protected for conservation, those acres would not count towards developable acres in these calculations. So the way to find the number of development rights for at risk of residential development is to find the average housing density of the newest residential zone within 2 miles of the farm. And then you run into the question of how do you find publicly available data, especially to show you the newest residential zone. So what we did on our team is we turned to the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau, and it provides the number of houses per census tract built by decade. And so we looked at the tract that the farm is in, as well as neighboring census tracts. And the farm tract itself contained homes built most recently. So we stuck with that tract. And we looked at areas of that tract that are currently zoned as low density residential and within 2 miles of the farm. So we were overlaying more information. And we also wanted to mention selected only structures greater than 1,000 and less than 10,000 square feet. And so that worked out to, so then we look at the number of houses in those areas and the number of acres to get a housing density average of 0.72 housing units per acre, which when we apply that to the 103 acres of the parcel comes to about 74 houses or development rights. Now for everybody's favorite slide that you've all been waiting for, the one with the equations. So before I show you those, I want to mention that all of the equations are calculated as per household and then multiplied by 74 households and then times 30 years, which is the window of time that the CARB methodology uses for calculating the climate benefit of an easement, even though an easement exists in perpetuity. Also, we're going to be talking in carbon dioxide equivalents, and those allow us to combine and compare different greenhouse gases and even soil carbon in terms of global warming apples to apples. So for example, 1 ton of soil carbon can be converted to 3.6 tons of carbon dioxide using their molecular weights. And also each of the equations that we're going to go through are really a simplification of the actual equations, which I can go into more detail in the Q&A. So we made a little chalkboard here. And so for calculating the avoided vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, we used, this is the equation that we had to adapt from the CARB methodology because there isn't as much transportation data available at a local scale in Illinois or most other states besides California. And so we calculated VMT for rural and urban households for Tazewell County using Illinois travel statistics. And the emission factor, EF out here, which I forgot to mention, emission factors are basically coefficients that allow us to convert things like miles or a unit of energy into grams of carbon dioxide equivalents. The emission factor for VMT accounts for improving miles per gallon over time and comes from the Federal Highway Administration. For avoided electricity use, we used an emission factor that's specific to the grid where the farm is located because different grids use different mixes of fuels and so have different emission factors. The electricity use for rural and urban households comes from the Energy Information Administration's Residential Energy Consumption Survey, or RECS, which provides rural and urban household energy use by region of the US. Then the method also looks at the benefit of the urban households using natural gas as opposed to rural households, which can use propane. And so we have a specific emission factor for propane and a different one for natural gas because propane is a dirtier fuel. And I forgot to mention what all these subtractions are about. So let me go back to help this make more sense for you. The methodology considers two scenarios. The what I'm calling the rural scenario, which is if those 74 households were developed on the farm parcel. So those are the larger homes with more transportation needs. And then you compare that to if the same number of households were built as infill, more compact dwellings in an urban setting, access to public transportation, more energy efficient, that kind of thing. And the difference between the two is the climate benefit that we can attribute to the easement. So that's for those three. Then we also consider a one-time calculation of the soil organic carbon that would be lost from excavation at the site for the homes to be developed. We convert that also into CO2e. Then we add those together to get the climate benefit in CO2e of the first 30 years of the easement. The method also provides a similar calculation for non-greenhouse gas pollutants, including PM 2.5, NOx, volatile organic carbons, and diesel particulate matter. The worksheet tool is an Excel spreadsheet that we made for making these calculations for Bishop Farm, and that is available at the link that we'll share at the end, along with the report and all the other goodies. Oh, that's off, but it's supposed to, the box here is supposed to say to notice the calculation does not involve how the land is managed. Most easements do not dictate how farmland is managed. However, we will talk about that at the end for this particular project. The Conservation Fund was interested in what additional climate benefits could happen on the farm with more conservation practices on the land. So let's jump into the results and talk about some of the limitations of the study. We estimated that about 19,541 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents would be avoided in the first 30 years due to the easement. That's equivalent to about 108 rail cars worth of coal not being burned. Or you can think about it as the emissions from 4,200 gasoline-powered passenger vehicles taken off the road for 1 year. If we break down those 19,500 tons, about 38% of the benefit comes from more efficient transportation, 40% from reduced electricity consumption, 20% from protecting the soil carbon, and the propane benefit contributed less than 1%. The non-greenhouse gas pollution avoided was or would be about 8.8 metric tons. And remember that was particulate matter, 2.5, NOx, volatile organic carbons, and diesel particulate matter. We were also interested in how this breaks down into a per acre per year number to compare to how other avoided conversion of other land types contribute to climate change mitigation. So on the Bishop Farm, it works out to about 6.3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre per year. If we look at avoided deforestation, that's about 40 tons of CO2e per acre per year. And avoided grassland conversion is about 10 times what the farm is doing at 62 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Now, that can seem like the easement is insignificant compared to other systems, but this is just one farm, so let's not extrapolate results to all farms. Also, the method does not yet incorporate avoided emissions from concrete use, which we're working on for our national tool, or the possibility that protecting farmland helps avoid grassland conversion to cropland. Let me explain. According to a 2020 study by Tyler Lark and colleagues, between 2008 and 2016, 1 million acres of US land was converted to crops every year. 88% of those new crop acres was converted from grassland. But showing a direct link between an acre of cropland protected in central Illinois and a protected acre of grassland in South Dakota is pretty complicated, but a potential area for future research at AFT. We were also interested in seeing how our estimate compares to other studies like this. there aren't a ton of these studies to compare to. So what we did was compare our estimate, which I'm showing as a blue triangle here in these box and whisker plots. And the box and whisker plots represent the distribution of data for the 2020 to 21 projects that used the quantitative method from CARB for the sustainable ag lands conservation in California. It's about 30 projects. A quick refresher on box and whisker plots. The middle line indicates the median. The left end of the box is the 25th percentile of the data. The right end is the 75th percentile. The whisker tips extend from the minimum to the maximum of the data, excluding outliers, which are shown as dots. So in this box and whisker plot, we're showing the thousands of tons of CO2e over 30 years. So that 19,000 is a bit low, but within the distribution of data from California. Then when we look at the tons of CO2e per acre per year, our estimate is within the middle 50% of the California data. Similarly, for tons of CO2e per household per year. And we were particularly interested in the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled per household per year, because you'll remember that that was the part where we had to improvise an equation because of less data availability for Illinois. And we were pleased to see that it falls within the middle 50% of the California data. So you might be wondering how that 19,500 tons of CO2e in 30 years compares to emissions from the farmland management. But first, I want to remind you that this is not part of the considerations for the climate benefit of the easement. But we were interested in this question just like you might be. So we turned to the Comet Farm tool, which you can get at comet-farm.com, which is available from USDA and Colorado State University. COMET stands for Carbon Management and Emission Tool for Individual Farms. It's a web-based platform for whole farm and ranch carbon and greenhouse gas accounting. The tool uses detailed spatially explicit data on climate and soil for each defined parcel and estimates carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and reductions using models and regional databases. Users enter detailed management information for both the historic and future scenarios for their operation. So we looked at 4 hypothetical scenarios in Comet Farm for Bishop Farm. This graph that I'm going to show you the results in is showing emissions in terms of metric tons of CO2e per year. So positive is emissions, climate warming. Negative is climate cooling or mitigation, negative emissions. So this first bar is for the baseline scenario, and that's what you use in Comet Farm to show what is the property doing without conservation practices. And so on the actual Bishop Farm, they are using no-till. So this would be an overestimate, likely an overestimate of what's actually happening on the farm. But this baseline scenario uses a corn-soybean rotation with 2 tillage passes prior to planting and 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre before planting and no cover crops. So the different colors of the bar are the different contributions to the emissions, and then the dot shows you the net effect. So the baseline scenario is net emitting, contributing to climate change. Then we looked at a conservation cropping scenario. So the same as the baseline, except we put in no-till with cover crops, and we substituted compost for about 1/3 of the nitrogen budget. So that flips the system into being a net climate cooling system, more sequestration than emissions. Then we were also interested in implementing some agroforestry practices. So agroforestry is this new yellow slice that's showing up here. And in that, we took 7 acres within the cropping area to plant black walnut alley crops. And in the last scenario, the multi-practice conservation scenario, we took 23 acres out of the cropping system to add a woodlot, riparian buffers, and 3-row windbreaks. Remember, these are hypothetical scenarios, and so we're just looking at one dimension of these systems, the climate benefit. So in this way, it's like, wow, this is the obvious one we should do. But in the real world, we would also need to consider the cost of the woody plantings to the farmer, as well as lost income from taking acres out of cropland production. So you might be wondering how these estimates compare to the avoided emissions due to the easement. So remember, that was in terms of the 30-year time frame. So if we take these numbers out 30 years, this system will emit about 1,800 tons over the next 30 years. That's about a tenth of the easement's avoided emissions. On the other extreme, this system will sequester about 3,000 tons over the next 30 years, which is equivalent to about a sixth of the easement's avoided emissions. So it isn't to say that conservation practices aren't important. 3,000 tons is a great number, as well as the intermediate systems. But really what this helps show to me is the putting the land use change in perspective in terms of climate solutions in agricultural lands. Also remember, this is just one farm. The slide might also have you thinking back to the 34 acres of woods that are already in existence that I mentioned on the farm. The easement protects that forest carbon in the trees and the soils, as well as future carbon sequestration by the trees. We did not include that in the avoided emissions calculation because we wanted to focus on the avoided conversion aspect, and not many farms in Illinois are made up, a third of them are woods. So be more representative of farms in the area. Some of the limitations of our study that you should consider, first of all, that these carbon estimates should only be used for planning purposes and not for selling carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market. Again, the results are for just one farm. We were unable to quantify uncertainty, and it's always hard to say exactly what would happen in an alternative future. If there was no easement, what would actually happen on this land? And we would need to assess an easement's climate relevance on a case-by-case basis. This tool could be used for other sites in the Midwest region, but you would need to, again, assess their climate benefit, their development context, and estimating the number of development rights would require knowing some of that zoning information, and then inserting that counties and states data in some parts of our tool, which we could be happy to help someone adapt it to. The methods could be improved in terms of accuracy with more detailed information about the age of homes in the vicinity of the farm, county-specific rural and urban breakdown of BMP, as well as proportion of passenger vehicles in the fleet. We could get site-specific soil organic carbon measurements. We could also estimate that protected forest carbon and future sequestration, and also account for emissions from differences in concrete and refrigerant use, landfill waste, and sewage treatment between the rural and urban scenarios. Now I'd like to finish up by mentioning the nationwide tool we are working on at AFT for estimating avoided emissions from easements. So basically taking what we did for the case study and making it more usable for anyone in the contiguous 48 states to start with. This will be a tool version 1.0 with not all the bells and whistles we can possibly imagine, but a proof of concept where we can identify data gaps and next steps for research. We plan to be finished by the end of September, so stay tuned. Users will have to bring to the tool the current and future zoning if that's available for the easement property, and we'll provide a checklist for users to determine if the easement is appropriate for climate mitigation, including that looking at the property being at risk of development and being part of a buffer or barrier to urban sprawl. Here's some of the ways that we're thinking the tool could be used, and that's primarily by land trusts and communities. They can use it to estimate avoided emissions to date from existing easements and potential future easements, and then use those estimates to apply for climate action funds and other fundraising. and use the estimate to communicate yet another important reason for farmland protection. So this is my last slide, and I wanted to reiterate some of our take-home messages. That the Bishop Farm case study of about 103 acres, we estimated about 19,541 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents would be avoided in the first 30 years due to the easement, which is about 108 rail cars worth of coal not burned, is about 10 times the emissions from a conventional ag management on the site, 6 times the sequestration from a multi-practice conservation scenario, including agroforestry, and 1/6 the mitigation from avoided deforestation, and 1/10 from avoided grassland conversion to cropland. But this is just one farm. I know I'm a broken record, but that's important to keep reminding you. We're going to share in the chat now this link, which provides the full report on the case study, a 2-page summary, the Excel tool, as well as a video demonstration of how to use the tool. Again, that tool that's up is just for Bishop Farm. We're working on our national tool. Remember that not all ag conservation easements necessarily have a climate benefit like the one we worked through today. Depends on the context. The national calculator tool in development will be for estimating emissions avoided due to easements nationwide, or in the contiguous 48, I should say. And if you're interested in partnering with us to further the research and or do a case study in your area, please feel free to reach out to us at climate@farmland.org. And thank you all so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks. So feel free to put things in the chat for your questions, or go ahead and raise your hand, or just come off mute and ask. So, Emmy, did you want to add something?
Well, I would say there's a question about sharing the methodology, Bonnie, the California methodology. Could you I think that's probably linked at the place at the Farmland Information Center, but maybe you could share an independent link.
Yeah.
Question from Jeremy about using a conceptual development plan as part of an appraisal for a conservation easement to help identify what the development rights are that are extinguished. And I guess I think that would be an excellent source of information to help identify what development rights are being extinguished. It is a case-by-case analysis, so you'd have to look at other information as well. And of course, it all depends on what you're using the data for. But if you're trying to generally calculate the climate benefit from easements for a kind of an internal use or public information sharing, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a great piece of site-specific information to look to.
Thank you. And I just added the link to the methodology that we use. And then there's also a 2022 update to that. And I'll work on getting that, or if Rachel or someone else on the call could look for that.
And then there's a note from Katie Adams from Savannah Institute that you often can generate income from agroforestry practices, so it may not be lost income, but potentially delayed income while those trees mature, which I think is a great point. I think, Bonnie, you can probably read the questions at this point. You're done.
Yeah, yeah. Going back to Jeremy's point about a development plan, yes, if you have a development plan that tells you the number of houses that are planned for that, then you don't have to go through all the estimation stuff. You have the answer right there of how many households to use. So that's a great point. So there's the link. To get carbon credits through this methodology for Lincoln's question. So great question. Currently, no, this is definitely just for use for planning purposes. That could be, a future step potentially for like a carbon market project developer, there would need to be, you know, an approved methodology with a registry for this, but they could build off of this method. However, this is what California uses for carbon credit trading in their state. So the precedent is there. Looks like we might also have questions in the Q&A part. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Okay, so now look at the Q&A part. Yeah. So Brian's question, wouldn't a before and after conservation easement appraisal conducted by a certified appraiser be comparable or even better means by which to identify the number of development rights extinguished? Yes, I think so. Emmy, I'm not familiar with the appraisal process. I'm more of an ecologist. So Emmy, can you tell us what that?
Yeah, so our appraisal for the easement on this project didn't give us a specific, we wanted more specific independent information than just what the appraisal offered, so that we can look at, use this methodology for properties that we haven't yet appraised. So yes, I think that point about the value of the appraisals is really helpful, but if we're going to use it as a tool to evaluate whether to appraise or prioritizing that, having some independent sources of information that would be available across the board was important to us.
And I noticed that Bailey put into the chat does not use this for carbon credit. So Bailey, it sounds like you might know more about this than me. If you want to come off mute and tell us.
Yeah, so the methodology that you're referring to is for the California Climate Investments Program. So that's the use of cap and trade dollars, but that is not used for any compliance grade and it doesn't generate any credits. We're just trying to count what the benefit is. In order to get compliance grade offset credits in California, you can only use, this can only be generated using a offset protocol, and there's only a few of them, and they're primarily the only ones used are forestry and dairy digesters. So we use this as a way to try to estimate benefits, but it's not up to the standards or rigor and not verified or validated or real and additional. So we can't use it for either compliance or voluntary carbon credits in California.
Awesome. Thank you, Bailey, for that information and for being here. That was really helpful. And then we have Dorothy's question. In terms of accuracy, I need to consider change in energy source over 30 years of electricity is produced by coal and switches to solar. How would that change the calculation? Yeah, so that would change the calculations. Although both sites would probably be on the same grid still, so they both would experience the same improvement in the energy reduction in the emissions from their energy use. So it would be a smaller carbon footprint for both of them, and it would reduce the climate benefit essentially. So that would be something we could account for. That we did that with the miles per gallon, like I mentioned. And so for doing that for the next 30 years, we would need some way of projecting forward how the grid will change over time. Be kind of the next step. And then Addie asks, a great question. What's the reason Alaska and Hawaii will not be included in the national tool? Part of the difficulty with those two is that the soil data, some of the other data availability is different. And there tends to be less available, is my understanding of why that is. But it's still in development and it's something that we can explore. Another thought, bottom line takeaway that the greatest impact comes from well-selected easements versus only a change in management practices, especially when there's no way to ascertain the likely longevity of any practice on farmland when at risk of conversion to development. Yeah, but I'm really wary to make any statements about like easement versus management practices. I don't know if Chris, you want to chime in on it, on that question?
I'm sorry, I was looking for a link
That's okay.
for something else. Tell me again the question?
Isn't one bottom line takeaway that the greatest impact comes from well-selected easements versus only a change in management practices, especially when
Right.
there's no way to ascertain the likely longevity?
Right. So I think that is absolutely right. That was a key takeaway from for me, that when you compare some management practices to the sort of underlying benefits from that avoided development, that seems to be higher. Now, that said, I think there are a couple of things that we would say from the AFT perspective. Right? Both are helpful, but they're sort of apples and oranges, because one is around easements and the permanent land protection, and the other is around management, and they can obviously be stacked on top and additive conservation to underlying easements. I would just make the point on easements is that one thing that AFT continues to believe in strongly, as far as the climate benefits associated with agricultural land protection, is that land protection is foundational to achieving many of the other climate benefits of agriculture. In other words, if we don't have the land base onto which to put some of these additional investments, such as in the new investments through the Inflation Reduction Act, it's hard to realize those benefits, so that one can look at sort of, I mean, obviously climate resiliency and the importance of agricultural land protection on that front, but in thinking broadly about those climate benefits, we take an expansive view of the importance of agricultural land protection more generally. Not just, I think, this is great in this report in that it is quantifying those benefits related to changes around low density residential development. But I think we would talk more broadly about climate benefits of all agricultural, permanently protected agricultural land.
Thank you. And then I think Emmy replied to Alexandra's question in the Q&A. And do these models include emissions from heavy machinery, emissions on the farm as well, number of trips taken on the farm in an average year? Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Comet Farm estimates are primarily looking at greenhouse gases, emissions from the soil, and carbon sequestration in the soil. I know from other studies of the that are kind of like a life cycle analysis of a whole farm, that the machinery, emissions from diesel make up a small component compared to things like nitrous oxide, emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. But that things like no-till do reduce number of passes, and is something to incorporate. Actually, there's a separate COMET tool or USDA tool for the energy use. If Rachel, if you want to add that link or come off mute and say something.
No, I think you covered it really well, Bonnie. There is the Comet Energy tool that can estimate reductions in diesel from conservation practices like no-till. That's a separate module, and I will add that link. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. Great question from Christopher here. I'm not clear on how you assume that the avoided development on this farm won't be readily absorbed on a nearby farm, aka leakage. This area seems to be a mosaic of open fields and residential subdivisions. I worry about overestimating the true benefits of our work, particularly when it comes to carbon issues. Thumbs up to that question. And that is something that we would like to figure out how to actually make that case. For example, in another situation from a farm that AFT helped get an easement on in California, that farm parcel was located next to like a state or county park. that lay outside of a city. So those two things are sort of creating this buffer that development in that direction isn't going to expand further. But making the case to show that it's not just going to happen on another farm is difficult, and I think a place that we should continue kind of thinking about how to make that method more tighten that up. So it sounds like something you're thinking about, Christopher. I'd love to talk more with you. If you want to come off mute and offer ideas or comments, welcome to do that if you're still here.
Hi, I am.
Yeah.
And this is an issue we deal with a lot in forest areas about avoided harvest here and how it leaks somewhere else, when obviously the impact is a global impact. So wherever that leakage happens to pop up, are we actually, getting the benefits that we're purporting? So I was just curious how you try to address that in this particular study.
Yeah, so for us, it was really making that case that part of that ag preservation district, which doesn't have actually regulatory teeth, it just sort of discourages residential development there. But if we could imagine more easements in that preservation district, that would be a nice buffer area. So it is a little hand wavy, but something we thought a lot about, and I'm really glad you brought up with that specific question. Because we don't want to. Oh, go ahead, Emmy.
Well, I was going to say, no, it's such a great question. And, we didn't really address leakage because we were just looking at the one farm, and we also, so that would have reduced the climate story, but also we didn't count a lot of things that are making a difference, like keeping the trees there and not being able to calculate the concrete factors. So I think, there is a danger of misusing this information. I think that's a really good point, is that these are kind of estimates to help us understand and do storytelling, but certainly there needs to be a lot of caveats, which I think we've tried to do all along. But Bonnie, my question was, does the SALC methodology account for leakage? Because I recall there was something maybe to look at in that methodology.
And Bailey can correct me. I see you're still here, but my understanding is that's more taken care of as part of the application process before a parcel goes through the quantification, is answering questions about the development pressure, as well as creating a barrier, a green belt around a city. But if someone from California on the call wants to add to that, feel free. Okay, well, this is all great. I want to end on time for everyone. Emmy or Chris, do you have anything you want to add? No? Okay. Thank you all. Great to be with you today. Bye-bye.